For most of us, I think Qawwali is synonymous with Hindi cinema because जब से Qawwali है, तब से Hindi cinema है, ऐसा बहुतों को लगता है. But Qawwali's history is obviously much older. But I think for most of us, and especially somebody like me, my introduction to Qawwali happened because I started watching a lot of Bollywood films. But what is the future of Qawwali? What are the kind of people who are listening to Qawwali? Do we all listen to Qawwalis? There are a lot of questions. And in the midst of all of this, there's a very interesting archive that Yousuf Saeed has been working on, which is called the Cinema Qawwali, where he's archived songs from around 1939, I think, till date. And there are around more than 600 songs so far that have been archived. So Yousuf sir is going to tell us more about Qawwali. Welcome, sir.
Okay, thank you, Tina. You see, Qawwali, it is assumed that it is a devotional song which is performed at Sufi shrines normally. But I want to tell you that Qawwali and as a Sufi song as well as an entertainment song has existed side by side. It is not exactly a Sufi song. It is a song type or a genre of music where you can sing any kind of lyrics. You can sing secular lyrics as well as devotional lyrics. So it is assumed, it is said that Amir Khusro, the Sufi poet from 13th, 14th century, who was there in Delhi, in fact, he started Qawwali. But there are references of the word qawwal and qawali in Arabic and Persian languages also prior to Amir Khusro. So as a song type, it has existed from much earlier. In India, we don't know exactly how Qawwali was performed before 20th century, because 20th century is the time when we started getting the recordings of the Qawwalis. So from the recordings, we know how it was performed, what happened before the recording, because in the textual sources, it's very difficult to find out what was happening in the Qawwali. I mean, there are, the Qawwals are not exactly the people who are singing a Qawwali in a dargah. The Qawwal could even be singing classical music or semi-classical music. So that has been generally the history. Now, in the 20th century, when the recording technology came and we started getting the gramophone records, so a lot of these early Qawwali were recorded. And you know, the earliest gramophone records were like 3 or 4 minutes long. So in that 3 or 4 minutes, somebody's tried to sing a Qawwali, which usually we assume to be, 20-minute long or 1 hour long. But at least from those 3-4 minute long recordings, we get to know how it was being performed in those times. So Qawwali has existed, and it is not just an elite kind of a musical form. It is a very popular musical form. It has existed throughout. People were singing in parties, in picnics, in home, in family affairs like weddings and other forms, apart from the Sufi shrine. So Sufi shrines, of course, there is Qawwali, it has existed, and the Sufis use Qawwali for their spiritual experiences, because the Sufis believe that in order to connect to God or to the Almighty or to the divine, they need some kind of a stimulus or some kind of a stimulant, and poetry provides them that stimulant. So it's the poetry of the song which is very important for the Sufis. The instruments and the rhythm, all that is secondary actually. I mean, there are references that the Sufis used to just listen to the recitation of poetry, and they would get their spiritual ecstasy through that. So that has been generally the history. Now, when the cinema came, cinema, if you know, has come from the technology of the cinema, of course, came from the West, from Europe. But before cinema, there was a theatre tradition in India. We had the Parsi theatre, we have the Nautanki, and several other types of, there is Ram Leela, and so many types of theatres. In the theatre, in the traditional Indian theatre, there was a storytelling, there is an acting going on, and in between the story, they would insert a song. So there was always songs in between. And those songs could be in different formats. Many of them were played on dholak, and harmonium was also introduced by the British at that time. So the dholak and the harmonium was used in the popular performances in those theatre things. And then when the cinema came, the same theatre tradition actually transferred into cinema. I mean, a lot of the plays being adapted into cinema. One of the first movies made by, for example, Dada Saheb Phalke were based on the theatre, on the plays that were being done on stage. So Qawwali was also part of that, and that Qawwali was being performed on theatre, on stage as part of these plays. So in a way, it came naturally to cinema, and then the Qawwali, even in cinema, has existed both as a devotional song as well as an entertainment song.
Okay. So tell us more about your project and why now, because if you're saying that the history is as old as cinema itself, so what is the significance of the project and how did you actually go about the process of selecting the songs? Because I feel like it's not always that we are very good at archives in general, trying to find old material, especially in a time before YouTube, is a tough task. Like you can't even find very old songs to listen to. So
yeah. So, I have always been interested in Qawwali and Sufi culture, especially Amir Khusro and Nizamuddin Aulia, these two figures who are there in Delhi, who were buried in Delhi. So some years ago, I was working on a documentary film on Amir Khusro because I was very fascinated by his personality, by his history, and I looked at his poetry and his history and what role he played in history. And I realized that he was a very prolific poet and he was also experimenting with the music of his time because he was employed in the royal courts of the kings at that time during the Delhi Sultanate period. And in the courts of the king, his job was not only to write the chronicles of those times, but also to write poetry which could be used in the evening entertainment, for example. So, the king is sitting in his court and he wants some entertainment, so poetry has to be sung. So, he was writing the poetry as well as composing that in music and using Indian music as well as Central Asian music, the Persian music. So, in a way, he was doing a lot of these experiments, and some of those experiments resulted into what the classical music traditions like khayal and tarana and qawali and qawl that we have today. Because the musicians and the vocalists that he was training or he was interacting with, they were using both the Indian music tradition as well as the Western, as well as the Central Asian music traditions. So that is how our a tradition of Hindustani classical music, the khayal and the tarana and these ghazal singing started at that time in 13th, 14th century. And so I was very much interested in that, and I made some documentation on that, and I was also documenting the live qawwali performance happening in the Sufi shrines. So I've been doing that for quite some time, and because I had a training in film, so I was also looking at the history of Indian cinema, Bombay cinema, and I was very fascinated by the fact that cinema uses a song. Every movie has 3, 4, 5, 6 songs. I mean, some of the older movies had 13 songs or 20 songs. Musical was a very important thing in Indian cinema. And you can't have all the songs in one genre or one kind of type, one kind of style. So like you will have a romantic kind of song where hero and heroine are singing and dancing in a park. But then you need some different types of songs also. And I realized that the qawwali is being used in the movies not just as an ordinary song type, but as a very, very, very unique song type where you can actually tell story through qawwali. So the directors of the cinema, they used qawwali as a storytelling device because you can do a lot of experiments with that. You can put a qawwali in a very unusual kind of a situation. For example, there are many movies which are about dacoits and criminals and supernatural kind of stories, mythology, and so the qawwalis have been put in that. Very interestingly, there are movies about Alexander, Sikandar. There is a movie in that Alexander is not from India, or any story which is not from India. For example, Rustam Sohrab and those kind of Persian stories, or Laila Majnu, or things which have come from outside India. They would put qawwali in it because they think that qawwali fits in that kind of a scenario. So very interesting. The dacoit movies have qawwalis, and many others. I mean, the most famous, Sholay film. It has a song which is something like a qawwali. That Mehbooba, Mehbooba. It has the Persian kind of instruments and Persian Arab kind of a belly dance and things like that. I mean, it's not exactly a qawwali, but it has that influence. So many other movies like that were using qawwalis. So I was very fascinated, and I started looking at some of those. And this is before everything was available on YouTube. I was buying these DVDs and VCDs in that time. So I have a large collection of VCDs and DVDs of those movies, where I saw all these qawwalis happening. And then, of course, now almost everything is available online. So it's become easier to search for these things. But searching for qawwalis from the movies was not easy, because there is no list. I mean, nobody has ever made a list that these are the qawwalis or these are. I mean, there are list of movies, there are list of songs, but it's very difficult to actually say that, okay, these are the qawwalis. So you have to actually look at all the qawwalis, So there are some qawwalis which are famous. I mean, if you ask anybody, any movie buff, how many qawwalis do you know? They would probably come up with 10 qawwalis at the most, 10 or 20, which are the most famous one. I mean, we have the most famous ones are, for example, the movie Barsat Ki Raat from 1960s, which was actually based mostly on the qawwali singing, because there are these two sisters who want to become qawwal, and how they have a competition with male singers. So it has that famous qawwali, Na to Karwan ki Talash Hai, Na to Humsafar. So that I consider as one of the best qawwalis. So in that period, 1940s, 50s, 60s, when it was a black and white, most of the movies were in black and white. The qawwalis which are used, they're using the classical Urdu poetry and romantic poetry. So there's a lot of, I mean, people who are purist would say that those are the pure qawwalis, those are the real qawwalis, where you have good literature being produced, and good connoisseurs could appreciate that. But after 1960s and 70s, then you have a different kind of a scenario where qawwali is being used as a kind of a very funny kind of situations, where like in every movie you have several elements. There is romance, there is music, there is violence, and there is also humor. So qawwalis were used for humorous kind of situations in many movies. The most famous one, for example, is Amar Akbar Anthony.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that.
So that movie, it has that song Parda Hai Parda, and the way Rishi Kapoor behaves in that, the way he jumps onto the stage, and the way he, his entire acting, it's very funny. It's a kind of a there is a word I would like to use here, which is masquerade. And I say that there are masquerade qawwalis, like they're being used for a kind to hide something, and something else is happening. So they have been used in so many kind of situations. So I realized that, and I mean, I just now said that in the 50s, 60s, most of the qawwalis were based on Urdu poetry, but the funny qawwalis were always there at that time also. There were things happening like mythological stories where there are fairies and jinns and all kinds of supernatural things happening, because Indian movies, Indian cinema is very much fascinated by these supernatural things, whether it's a religious movies or just the supernatural kind of scenarios. So they put these qawwalis there. They put qawwalis even in war and battles, like there is an army which is hiding somewhere and they have nothing to do, so they start singing a qawwali. So there are very interesting ways in which qawwali has been used to tell stories. And I believe that Indian cinema has actually taken qawwali from its devotional Sufi kind of a scenario and stretched it far to make it like an entertainment medium, which is a very important thing. This may not have happened in anywhere else except India, where you have a supposedly Islamic a song type, and it is taken into a non-Islamic, non-religious and kind of non-devotional scenario. So it's very, and that is what fascinated me, and I started collecting more and more, started looking at movies, and then I started making a list, kind of a chronological list of how, and my list is, it's not just a listing, it's actually, I'm trying to look at the trends that are happening over the years, like which singers are singing the qawwali, what kind of themes are more popular in which era. So I consider that 1970s are the time when the most qawwalis happened. Like in every year, there would be something like 20, 30 qawwalis being performed in the movies. So that is what I have realized. And of course, I mean, there are other people also who have worked, whoever is writing a kind of a history of Bombay cinema would not ignore songs, and especially qawwali. People have worked on it, but I'm also trying to analyze what has been happening over these 80, 90 years, from 1930s, 40s till 2022. What kind of qawwalis are being performed, and what are the trends, how things are changing, which performers, which musicians, which music directors are doing most of these qawwalis.
Okay. I feel like you'd sort of answered the rest of my two questions anyway in your answer, which is a good thing as well, because what I was going for is, what's the difference essentially between, what we understand as the quintessential qawwali, which we would understand as being performed, shrines or in other forms of performance and within the movie, and you've said that it brings in that element of storytelling and entertainment, which probably would not exist. I actually wanted to ask if you'd call yourself a qawwali purist, and if that is so, can you appreciate Bollywood qawwali? Because often what happens is, like, because you gave the example of Hindustani classical music. So if somebody who is into Hindustani classical music, who practices or even appreciates it, might not necessarily like how, elements of that are used in films, because sometimes obviously it can go in a very good way and sometimes it might actually fail to land, right? So could you tell us about that?
Yeah. You see, Bombay cinema is part of a popular culture. It's popular culture. It's not the elite culture. So you know that in India, whatever arts and culture we talk about, there's always some kind of arts which are elite arts, like classical music, dhrupad, dhamar, those only a few people can understand. Not everybody understands that. It is accessible to only a few people. Whereas there is a popular culture, there are folk music traditions in India. And I think the Bombay cinema caters to that popular, to the masses basically. And the directors who are sitting there in Bombay deciding what to keep in a movie, they have to think about what will sell in a movie, what will attract people in a movie. So they would obviously not think about the purist kind of ideas. They just want to sell. So, even if you talk to any of the music directors or the lyricists of Bombay cinema, they'll say that, look, we are catering to the masses. We don't care. We of course know that there is a classical tradition. There's classical Hindustani classical music, and there is also qawwali happening inside the shrines. In fact, even inside the Sufi shrines, there are two platforms. There is one public platform, like if you go to the Dargah of Nizamuddin on a Thursday evening, you will find a large gathering, large crowd listening to the qawwali, and they would be singing the more popular type of qawwalis, even if they are Sufi qawwalis. But within the Sufi shrine, there's also a very exclusive mehfil or a gathering where only the Sufis sit. And they have certain etiquettes of listening to music, and those etiquettes have to be followed. And there is also a kind of it is also a very male driven thing, because they don't allow women singers, for example, in a Sufi shrine. So there are exclusive Sufi mehfils where they would only sing very, very exclusive poetry of Amir Khusro, of Rumi, of Sadi, and those kind of poets, Urdu poets, Persian poets. So obviously, from that purist point of view, what is being produced by the Bollywood is, is just popular culture. I have this debate with a lot of people, but I don't ignore popular culture. I take popular culture very seriously,
right,
because I think that is what the people are. The people need that kind of music. So it's a it is very important to take to take the Bollywood music also seriously as to why it is being produced, who is demanding it, and so on.
So, because you mentioned Amar Akbar Anthony, and it was a song, it's a song of my childhood. So, and it was very popular when I was growing up. It was everywhere from radio to television. But like you said, that Akbar's role and his sort of get up, right? I think for a long time during that period, that became sort of like a standard trope. The clothing, the mustache, the cap. I was wondering if Bollywood used qawali to create a certain kind of trope of Muslim characters, and how important were these gestures or clothes in that?
Yeah, that's a very important question you have asked. Actually, I have worked on this stereotype of the communities, especially Muslim community, and I definitely think that the Qawwalis has created that stereotype. For example, there is a film, I'm forgetting the name of the film, but Pran is there in it, and he is singing a Qawwali in a child's birthday party. And he says his name is Banne Khan Bhopali.
Right.
And he is wearing those typical, the cap, and then there's a pink handkerchief in his hand, and he's acting like a Muslim, as a Muslim would be. So it is creating, Bombay cinema has created that Bollywood, that has created the Muslim stereotype, definitely through many movies. There was a whole series of movies which was called the Muslim Socials, which were actually made for the Muslim families. Normally Muslim families, they are very orthodox. They would not send their women to a cinema hall to watch a movie. So then somebody thought that, okay, let's make movies which would be catering to the families, Muslim families, so that they come to watch. So there are these Muslim social movies which are about family situations and a Muslim family, and how a devoted Muslim or a pious Muslim should look like, how a woman should be praying like that, wearing a dupatta and all that. So there were these movies made. They were meant for a certain community, but through that a stereotype was created, and the Qawwalis have been very successful in creating that stereotype. For example, there was a movie called Allah Rakha, in which again, Main Allah Rakha, the way he dances and the way he acts in that, Jackie Shroff, I think, he's creating that stereotype of the typical Muslim, and also the Muslim coming from a Bombay kind of a Muslim ghetto. So that is a kind of an image that has been created. A person who goes to the Sufi shrine, who goes to the Haji Ali Dargah or to the Ajmer, so all those things, there's a whole series of movies that have explored this, and Qawwalis have appeared in many of those. You should also remember that the movies are made for masses who are poor people, who belong to a certain poor class, lower middle class people. And they have their own problems, they have their own issues, and to resolve their issues, they often go to a Sufi shrine or to a temple or wherever. So in a way, the directors of the movies are catering to their needs, that okay, if you have a problem, if you have some kind of an issue in your family, in some kind of a thing happening in your crisis happening in your family, then you go to a Sufi shrine. So even the movies are exploring those ideas, those themes, and the Qawwalis are exploring. So many of the Qawwalis are being sung inside a Sufi dargah, where the protagonist of the movie comes because that person has some problem, and then she or he comes, and then they the Qawwali is being sung, and the protagonist is praying to the shrine, and then suddenly there's a ray of light which falls on the dargah, and then her problem gets resolved. There's a blind child who starts seeing, or there's a child who has died and he comes alive. So there are many of those miracles which are performed through the Qawwalis. So in a way, it's catering to a certain class of people, a certain community.
So, like when we've been discussing, and I guess, like you said, the 70s is when the Qawwalis sort of were probably the most used. And then the coming in of 90s, 2000 is a very significant moment again, because there's a marked departure in the kind of films. But one of the songs is the Main Hoon Na, Shah Rukh Khan's, like Tumko Dekha To. And you have the element again, there's a background. It's a very modernized form of Qawwali. Then you have Rockstar. which had like the iconic song Kung Fai Kung, which became a thing where I think it increased the footfall in the Nizamuddin Dargah. Like you said earlier, it used to be a very Bombay, Haji Ali Shrine sort of a moment that would be captured, and you did not actually have the Delhi part of the history being coming up. So anything on that, how these sort of songs, I think, sort of again brought back that sort of popularity of the qawwali, if not in its original form, but maybe by infusing elements of modernity or something.
Yeah. Actually, the Qawwali revival happened in the 1990s because of the popularity of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan as the Qawwali singer. So I always consider the phases, two phases of Qawwali, the pre-Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and the post-Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And most people who have appreciated Qawwali or who have got to know about Qawwali after Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, so they're missing out a lot of the things which were happening before that. So there's a lot of change which happened even in the performances because the impact of Nusrat Sahab, he was a great artist, he was a great performer. So he had a big influence on everybody, on all the singers, not just the Sufi singers, but even other singers in Punjab and in Pakistan, India and everywhere. So he influenced the Qawwali singers in a major way. They started singing in a different way. And then that came in the cinema also. And then the next influence was A.R. Rahman, for example, because the way he started doing his music, that also influenced a lot of Cinema Qawwali. So I would say that after the 1990s, with these two great influencers, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and A.R. Rahman, the Qawwali has become, in fact, they've started using the word Sufi song in the movies now instead of Qawwali. I mean, they do use some Qawwali also. So it has changed its form. They're using different kind of music. It is no longer that very rustic kind of music which was there with just the dholak and tabla and harmonium. Now they have started using synthesizer and synthesized music and many other kind of things. They also started using things like sort of Turkish influence. For example, Jodha Akbar, we have the Qawwali Khwaja Mere Khwaja, in which the music is also very different and the qawwals are wearing these Turkish kind of caps and sort of whirling in a very different way. So a lot of interesting influences coming, probably because they want to keep the qawwali more popular and keep the lyrics more popular. Another thing which I would like to mention here is that the use of the lyrics, a lot of qawwalis in the movies are still using lyrics of Amir Khusro, for example, Chhap Tilak Sab Chhini, Aaj Rang Hai, Man Kunto Maula and Maula. So that is something that has been being used a lot. I've also, looking at all these 8-9 decades, I've also looked at what are the different keywords that are being used in the qawwali. So, for example, I realized that the words like Mola and Allahu, they are being used more after 1990s and not so much before. Because in the previous times, it was a very rustic kind of qawwali. It was like, like the village or small town qawwali which was being used. The shrine, but now it has become more like an international, because the movies in Bombay are being made for an NRI community and the international community, so they want to cater to that kind of audience also. So that's why they use that sort of international, global sort of music influence in qawwalis.
Okay. So this is the last question, but basically, what do you think about the future of qawwali? We know that we've existed for almost 8-9 decades, as you pointed out, and it is popular clearly. Because of either Nusrat's or his son eventually taking it up, and then now because we have more programs. I mean, for example, we have the Coke Studio Pakistan, which is like immensely popular, and you do hear, forms of qawwali being used there. We have other forms, and because now we have the YouTube and multiple apps also from Spotify to everywhere else, there's more scope to get to know, like you pointed out, qawwalis from also other places, which is not restricted anymore to India or specifically even this belt. So I was wondering, what do you think is the future of qawwali in cinema?
I think the qawwali is going to remain in cinema. It's not going to go away, because we have seen in the last 8-9 decades it's been there. It is not going to go away because of the themes and the situations that we have in the cinema. the kind of themes, the kind of storylines that are explored in the cinema. I believe that whatever modernity, whatever modern things that you can bring into the movies, you still have to compete with the other artist. So
Right.
what happens is that when there is competition, you want to become better and better. In order to become better, you will probably go back to your traditional music. So you will see that even though our music is very modern, but we are going back to the tradition also. I mean, you mentioned Coke Studio Pakistan. This is exactly what they are doing. They are making the traditional music modern. So I foresee that in the future films there will be qawwali, there will be Sufi music, and they will keep on exploring older lyrics and bringing them out. There are other poets like Kabir and Mira and so many bhakti poets, Sufi poets whose poetry will be used, because you can't just do modern things. You have to, in order to compete, in order to become better, you have to go back to your past, you have to go back to your roots. And our roots are classical music, qawwali, and bhajans, or whatever, all these. So I think it is going to remain there. The only thing is that see, the Qawwals or the Sufis, they don't want you to just get lost in your sensuous kind of scenario. Like, don't make songs which are only sensuous. They should be songs which the lyrics are so deep that they allow you to think about what is happening. So I think that is what my concern is, that it should not be just a sensuous kind of music. It should be a deeply lyrical music. It should have lyrics which are deep rooted and where you can which can make you think. For example, I mentioned the 1960 qawwali, Na to Karwan ki Talash Hai, from Barsat Ki Raat. The entire qawwali, it's a long qawwali, 7-8 minute long or even longer. The entire qawwali is filled with poetry, poetry which is invoking God, invoking love, invoking romance, so many things. So I think it is important to use the lyrics so that people think about it, what's happening, and they just don't get lost in the musicality or the lyrics or the just the rhythm of the qawwali.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very fascinating interview. I don't think it's always that we get to learn so much in a span of around half an hour. At least for me, this has been revisiting some of the songs and qawwalis that I have grown up with, and then my trips to Nizamuddin Dargah and experience of watching. I think it came together in a great way. Thank you so much again for coming and telling us more about this. The Cinema Qawwali project is something that you should definitely look up, and he has documented so well, and I'm saying it because I have gone through a lot of it, and there are details. If you are interested in music, if you are somebody who would want to learn more about qawwalis, I think this is like the best place right now to look up. If you want to have more interviews like this, do give us suggestions as well, and thank you.
Thank you.